I'd like to welcome you to the third keynote address at Uncommon Senses 5. And it gives me huge pleasure to introduce Sundar Sarukkai. And let me just give you a bit of background. 2-3 years ago, Sohail Kajar was my TA. We were talking, and he mentioned the work of Sundar Sarukkai, which I had not heard of up until then. This is one of the works, a co-authored work, called Experience, Caste, and the Everyday Social by Gopal Guru and Sundar Sarukkai. I went and got the book out of the library, and I started underlining and making marginalia all over it. And this marginalia really mattered to me. How was I going to return it to the library? Because there are these scribbles all over it. So I declared the book lost, and I therefore had to pay a substantial fine as well as the replacement fee for the book. But I have this book with all of my notes to myself in it. Now, I do have a habit of marking up books. There are many books in the Concordia Library that have my annotations in them, but I never bought them. The only other book that has this honor is Marx's Capital. Okay, so you're in good company, Sundar. I think that's a great book too, and I think they are both equally revolutionary. Sundar is a philosopher, yes, but even more than that, he is a public intellectual. And I think not enough of us academics anymore know what it is to be a public intellectual, to be in the fray, to really shape public opinion. But through his work, and he's had many positions in the past, but what he devotes himself to doing now is, above all, as the founder of Barefoot Philosophers. What a wonderful idea. The founder of Barefoot Philosophers. So not academic philosophers, barefoot philosophers, like the barefoot doctors of China. It's an initiative to take philosophy to children and the public. Okay, what a wonderful initiative to take philosophy to children and the public, and especially to take the senses to children, because there are all those books, the 5 senses for children, which are closing down their senses. And one of the things that Sundar does is open our understanding, our minds to the senses in some very compelling ways. I have approached the senses through a European trajectory. It starts with George Simmel, 1907, Sociology of the Senses, an amazing, amazing piece that lay fallow for many years and then gets revived and informs a sociological approach to the senses. But what you're going to hear now from Sundar talking about sensing the social is another approach from a different point of departure to understanding sensing the social, not just the sociology of the senses, but sensing the social. I found that encountering, this book was a tremendous source of revelations, things that I just hadn't considered. And it's precisely that cross-cultural approach to knowledge, which Sundar has been exploring in a variety of ways. He's trained in philosophy in the States, but he's also deeply immersed in the traditions of Indian philosophy. Bring them together. Now, that's not usually done, but bring them together. And both are enriched, but especially, Western philosophy. Okay, and indeed, often you will see his books praised for what they do in terms of the crossings. Just let me read one quote about Social Life of Democracy, a book from 2022. Sarukkai, standing on the shoulders of these two, Ambedkar and Gandhi, outstanding thinkers, interrogates the Western understanding of democracy and liberates the idea of democracy from Eurocentric perceptions. What? The idea of democracy had to be liberated from Eurocentric perceptions? This is the radical understanding that you are going to be introduced to this afternoon. I am delighted that Sundar made his way here. And there was a lot of planes in there, but thank you so much for being here, and please.
Thank you, David. It's a great honor and pleasure to do the keynote for this conference. Um, Greater pleasure that we finally met after our conversations over the last few years, and also to meet such a broad range of people working in this, to me, a new discipline called sensory studies. So much of what David was talking about, my earlier work, were all framed from other kinds of disciplinary preoccupations. And to be able to recognize that there's this growing kind of discipline called sensory studies was for me, it was a game changer in the sense my earlier work on touch and untouchability immediately began to take on different contours. And I was, as part of wanting to explore this, I took this opportunity to come here to see what is happening in the field and to learn from this very diverse knowledge which is being produced within this field. Um, I had wanted to, I have a paper which I thought I was going to read a part of it and highlight certain parts, important themes in it. But after David's inaugural keynote, somebody else also mentioned about the talking heads caution. So I was slightly worried, and all the talks I've been hearing had so many nice photographs and so on. So I sat down and tried to add some photos and thought I should present the gist of the ideas which I want to engage with. So give you an idea of what it is to think through this particular problem. Why did it matter to us? To me and my colleague Gopal Guru, with whom I've done 2 books. And for those of us who are interested in understanding the social structure, not just of a place like India, but social structure of various societies around the world. And while I say this, there is always a kind of an inherent tension that the socialities of something called the global south and global north have to be distinguished, something called Europe and Asia and so on. So, but the larger question for us is social a universal term, first of all? Is it applicable and available to every society in the way we take it for granted, particularly within sociology and the larger disciplines of social sciences? So, all these questions really animated us, but most importantly, it was in working on empirical data with the societies and in order to understand that we make sense of societies, not just to give a intellectual academic understanding of them, but in order to be able to be participants in their transformation. That that idea also influenced a lot of what I've been working on in the last many years. So before I start on the specificities of this particular idea of sensing the social, I want to come back to David's talk because it gave me a platform to which allowed me to say something which I've been wanting to say, but it gives me you have legitimized my particular what I wanted to say about disciplines in general, and particularly a new discipline like sensory studies. Of course, when I look at the material in sensory studies, the extraordinary work in, for example, in the sensory studies manifesto and so on, there's a lot of work which is drawn from a particular intellectual tradition, and that this makes sense. There is a long history of what we would call as Western intellectual traditions, Western philosophies, social sciences. So they obviously are going to be the foundation upon which many of these ideas are developed from. But for me, the important question is, how does the rest of the world respond to this question? Because there's nothing unique about senses. Senses belongs to all of us. There are very interesting anthropological accounts of the senses, which have been wonderfully delineated. But yet, where is the intellectual contribution to understanding the senses? That is, does the non West become an empirical subject for the theoretical West? Is the complete world of the non West, to use a you know, very facile categories, but I want to use it provocatively, polemically also. The entire category of non-West, are they just empirical subjects who have to be understood, who have to be made sense of through categories of a particular Western intellectual traditions. And that's a larger question which might interest many of us in these regions. And I'm, you know, taking the liberty of bringing it to you, right? And asking, how does the world look like when intellectual contributions from around the world animate your understanding of your society? That's crucial. Because for us, the Western intellectual world illuminates our societies. So where does this asymmetry, how do you make sense of this asymmetry? This was a very important provocation for my first book with Gopal called The Cracked Mirror, which I'll mention very briefly. But I want to extend that to the case of sensory studies in a more slightly jocular way, because there's so much about food, which was David talked about, including leading us to the insipid banquet, which is quite inspiring for me, as you will see. That I was looking at all these discussions on white bread and margarine and tasteless popcorn and stuff. And I was saying, look, the real big difference is actually the chili. I mean, for me, if I want to talk about any sensory experience, it's the chilies which, for me, stands as the exemplar of these different cultural differences. The chili, which is not just about a taste. You don't taste chili, you feel it, you live it. Then it's not, it's, you just can't bite into it and say, oh, that's a taste of chili, right? And so chilies are very interesting for me in various ways. Every day when I go to the market, the images which I see, this is definitely not from India. But I must also mention this, which is very ironically, I was trying to download pictures of chilies, and they're all copyrighted by Western companies. And whereas we are surrounded in a world of chilies, which are more like this, not this. If it moves, yeah, this one. This is the world of chilies I live in. This is the world of chilies you merge into, which you put your hand in and pull out and squeeze and make dishes like this. This to me is a very important essence of this deep sensory bridge, the chasm between the sensory worlds, which has deep implications to the way we understand the senses themselves. And this is why, for me, I must, I hadn't thought of doing this chili thing, so I must blame David for this. But after all this white bread thing, it's really, I enjoyed the white bread for a long time. But I said, there is something about the white bread question which David asked, which really went deep into my, question about what is it? What is this about whiteness and the white breadness he was talking about? And so I felt like white bread, there is hope for white bread or white, whatever, and which is very simple. You just have to color it. I'm saying a lot of other things, but you know what I mean. And coloring the bread, I also have a great food example for us. There is a dish called vada pav, which is, I would say, the national dish of India in some sense. It's very famously associated with Mumbai, but it's one of the most remarkable dishes. Not very healthy dish, but if I show you the picture of it, you will know what I mean by it. With vada pav, you don't taste it. It's in the best way to describe this sensorially is it's really hot in Mumbai or across most parts of India. When it is really hot, you bite into it, and every part of your being starts waking up. There is nothing comparable. Sorry, David, definitely not maple syrup. There is, because there is something else which it does. And I think the vada pav is now my metaphor for sensory studies. What vada pav does is to take a white bread, basically it's white bread, and then put chilies inside it. And it completely transforms the very idea both of whiteness and of the chilies. And it is in this coming together of your different culinary practices, let's say of you have the very good examples of maple syrup, And which provokes me to ask very politely ask this question: how do you spice up sensory studies? What does it really mean to spice it up? I was very surprised when I walked down this road. There are so many Chinese and Japanese restaurants. I was quite surprised. Spice is very easily consumed in terms of taste. But when I talk about spicing of sensory studies, I'm talking theoretically, intellectually, where are your spices from? These are my everyday spices. These are the spices I live with every day. 90% of the world lives with such a surplus of spices in their lives. When I talk about the possibility of engaging with the idea of senses, engaging with the idea of body from other traditions, basically asking the question: where does sensory studies today in Western academia, where is it going to draw its spices from? So it is within that context I want to frame what I will say further on everyday social, with this as the background. As David mentioned, much of the work in this has been from these two books called The Cracked Mirror, which came first in 2012, and then Experience, Caste, and Everyday Social. Both of these were an attempt to make sense of the idea of experience, make sense of the idea of caste, also to understand the various kinds of socialities which seem to be unique to different societies. But talking about experience in an academic manner, to some extent, I found it very useful, but also very tiring, because there is something about sensory experiences, talking about senses, which routinely challenged me in my own attempt to formulate them in academic framework. And so the two books which followed these academic works, they're both novels and they're both about the senses. Following a Prayer is actually about the sensation of language and silence, seen through the eyes of three young girls who want to understand what is it to experience language and silence, and what it is about the synesthetic experiences of a city and the languages of a city. So why I'm saying that is, in a sense, what I'm going to say draws extensively upon this set of body of work, and I'm sure there are gaps in what I'm going to say. You may want to look at some of them, or we can always talk over the next 2 days here. So I want to begin with a very simple observation, which is something which all of us know, which is that all philosophy globally begins from the senses, and that's my interest in the senses. And when I look at the global history of philosophy, the global history of philosophy is written with the first chapter as a global history of the senses. And what does a global history of the senses really mean? The idea that philosophy begins with that is to ask the basic question: what do we perceive? How do we perceive? And whether it's the Indian or Greek traditions, one can clearly see this in their primary texts of all these philosophical disciplines. Look at some of the most wonderful writing on the nature of the senses comes from Chinese philosophical traditions. And the Chinese idea of sciences is so radically different that it seems a pity that we are not able to integrate those theoretical framework in our understanding of what senses are, and therefore their relationship to what philosophy really is. There are certain kinds of very fundamental questions about senses, which are again common to many of these intellectual traditions. And I just want to highlight two aspects of it. One is a point which people in sensory studies are far more attuned to than most other disciplines that I'm aware of, which is the ocular centrism of descriptions of many of these disciplines, right? Including in philosophy, including in the way in which senses are thematized. So there have been very many interesting questions around it. I want to just try and highlight four thematic problems about the idea of the senses, which you might have obviously encountered in different ways, but I want to use them as a framework to talk about the problem of the sensing the social. One is that the sense, whether if you start with five senses, which seems to be common across many of these traditions, in early Chinese and Indian traditions, there have been more. In some accounts, you have 10, but largely there's a stability around this idea of five as external sense organs. But one of the most important conflict in describing our senses in terms of five sense organs which are directed, is that they are incomplete. They cannot give an account of perception just by having these five senses. So typically in a very important text, the Sankhya school is one of the schools of Indian philosophy, whose early formulations were common to many other philosophical disciplines. You would always, whenever you talk about the senses, all of them begin first with the senses, because all the conceptual term which philosophy is interested in, including ideas of knowledge, nature, truth, etc., begin from this inability of the senses, the inadequacy of the senses. But all of them always postulate other senses, other organs, if not other senses. This incompleteness of the sense in a larger sense. I want to leave this back behind with you, that the senses, by the physical senses by themselves, cannot do the job that they have supposed to do. The second more intriguing aspect of it is that every account of the senses always go beyond the mere materiality of the sense organs. The fact that, so when these philosophical texts, by the way, typically structured in a way in which it is they state something, and then there are huge commentaries and arguments and counter arguments for it. It's within the larger nature of philosophy as debate. In that tradition, we find typically, and this is something which is, I think, far more global, very interestingly again in Chinese thought, the fact that the materiality of the senses always have to be distinguished between what is called as gross matter and something else. Other people have tried to invoke ideas of consciousness, mind, ideas of energy, whatever that means, and so on. But this idea that there is a fundamental problem of the idea of materiality in our understanding of the senses. The question of I focus on the idea of materiality because any talk about sensing the social engages with this larger problem of materiality. Okay, and that's really one of the fundamental things. The third point is that the senses seem to be directed outward, that the eye sees the world outside, the ear hears a sound from outside, and so on. But the internal directedness of the senses seems to be a very important problem in all these philosophical traditions. How do we sense the inner? If all senses in these five senses are directed outwards, what does it actually mean to talk about the inner? And therefore, in a particular philosophical tradition, you could then understand questions of, for example, the reality of things like space, time, abstract concepts, and so on, as produced by the sensation of the mind, quote unquote, the mind's eye, that kind of an image. But the larger question is, are they even sensible? Are they in any sense of the term? And in that sense, the nonsense of space and time. And the final point is actually quite intriguing. There's a lot of wonderful discussion on this very simple fact that the sense organs cannot sense themselves. Because I mentioned that because it gives me an excuse to introduce one of the greatest philosophers, whom I think is on par with somebody like Kant in terms of his contribution to Western philosophical thinking. I mean Immanuel Kant. This philosopher comes, whose name is Nagarjuna, from the 2nd century, seen as one of the foundational philosophers in the Buddhist tradition. He's basically a logician. These Buddhist philosophers were very, very, very rigorous logicians. And he asks a simple question in one of his foundational texts called Mula Madhyamika Karika. He asks a very simple question. And there's a long discussion around this by himself, by generations of scholars who come after that, which is that, and this is his quote, he says, that very seeing does not see itself at all. How can something that cannot see itself see another? It's a larger question posed to the idea of the functions of sense organs. What really are the sense organs? If you want to look at a biological image, you do recognize that the eye is not enough to explain the job of seeing, for example. You need various other kinds of structures, a completely visual system to help you make sense of what seeing really is. But when Nagarjuna is asking this question, he's also asking something far more interesting, which in the context of sensory studies, I can reframe it in a particular manner. This is not how Nagarjuna would rephrase it. And this is the idea of the impact of ocular centrism, which has influenced the very way in which we have understood senses, how our experiences are structured, and influence of many of the basic conceptual terms which we engage with in our disciplines, including the questions of on the very deeply fundamental philosophical question about discreteness and continuity, which has had such a major impact in, foundational principles in mathematics, and then therefore on Western philosophy too. If all of these, in a sense, arise from some problem of oculocentrism, to me, one of a very nice way of making sense of what I wanted to say about this problem of oculocentrism and concepts was actually suggested when I read John Lee Clark, and many of you are already aware of his work. And I just want to, draw one small bit of his extensive work when he talks about the impact of visual biases and values, to quote him. So when he's talking about in his thing on metatactility, we had a lovely session yesterday on protactility. John Lee Clark, when he talks about, quote, what he calls as visual biases and values that, in his words, mentally, socially, and emotionally constrain deaf-blind children. And that whole discussion of what does it actually mean to encounter the question of touch and tactility, to me, it gave me a framework of understanding by extending this particular concept to the visual biases of the conceptual construction of the world. And I really liked his phrase, tactile freeze, which inhibits the inherent exploratory capacity of the sense of touch. So, for example, in that essay, he talks about how there is so much of constraint which people put on deaf-blind children on how they can explore, take care, don't touch this, don't touch that, and so on, which is something which is extended across social norms, right? Even for people who are not deaf-blind. But the tactile freeze connected reminded me of something very important about the idea of concepts itself, which is that the German term for concepts, very often discussed in philosophy, is as Begriff. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right. It actually connotes grasping something, holding on to something. Conceptual idea of a concept itself is the capacity to do this, and therefore the image which really describes what concepts are, which frame the world, which makes sense, which allows us to make sense of our experiences in the world, are all driven by a larger image of touching and not seeing. And this, therefore, drawing upon what John Lee was saying, I wanted to explore this possibility that concepts too suffer from visual biases and tactile, and therefore there is a tactile freeze in the way we deploy concepts, in the way we use concepts. And part of the tactile freeze is our inability to draw upon other cultural, intellectual contributions to their theories of the senses and the theories of the body. There have been so much of interesting work on the body, for example. The embodied, cognition is now so big. I've myself heard many talks here, which all come back to the question of body. But the body is the central question for a philosophical analysis in all Eastern traditions, like Western traditions too. But for Eastern traditions, the body is the beginning. There is no mind-body dichotomy. There is no escaping the body into the mind. The mind is material in a particular manner, like the body is. And all their accounts of giving a phenomenological account of the experiences of the body makes them produce these very complex theories of the body. Okay, so the tactile freeze of our conceptual vocabulary is this inability for us to explore conceptual world of these same ideas, same concepts of senses and body and whatever else we talk about, trying to grasp these ideas which have been produced from other cultures and communities and civilizations. What would that do to our understanding of this larger domain of sensory studies is a larger question, but in terms of very specific ways of understanding what a human individual is and what a society really is. I say this because every time we talk about the social, the first response is this kind of a suspicion towards the ontology of the social. Why do you want to talk about the social? When we talk about the ontology of the social, what we are saying is that we are raising this question of whether there is something called the social that we have to engage with. Is it something which is causal? Am I responding to something called the social? And when we talk about this question of social ontology, both from a long history of sociology itself, there is a kind of a suspicion, particularly among the founding fathers of sociology itself. Right from them, the question of what could this thing called the social be? Why would we want to invoke it? Now, one of the most interesting reasons for invoking this question of the social, which will connect us to this problem of tactile freeze, is the fact that if we pay attention to what a science does in the context of what we mean by social science, we pay attention to it. What a science does is not just produce methods and do other kinds of descriptions. It produces an ontology. You cannot understand natural science without understanding its ontology, the kind of objects which proliferates the very possibility of science. Science is not just in this notions of logical analysis or evidence and conclusions from evidence. It is the production of particular ontologies. And science is very comfortable with its ontologies. Its ontologies for a discourse which is about the real physical world, its foundational ontology are all immaterial. It's most important, the foundations upon which a discourse of the real rests are completely immaterial. I'll give you a very simple example as we go along, but just as in a more in a lighter sense, the idea of complex numbers, which is so important for modern science. Without it, you could not produce the kind of science we do. The word imaginary numbers, which is this I, which is square root of -1, is itself a parody. When they use the word imaginary number, they are talking as if all other numbers are real. And there is this thing called which is imaginary. And but for mathematicians, for the use of mathematics in the sciences, it is true that numbers are real. And that commitment to the belief in the reality of numbers and all mathematical entities is such a foundational principle of philosophy of science that I think it's impossible. There have been wonderful work in philosophy of science to show this. It's impossible for you to construct a theory of science, of what we call as today's modern physics and so on, without accepting the ontology of these abstract, non-existent, non-spatio-temporal mathematical entities. And then social scientists get bothered about something called social, which is, in fact, when you look at the idea of the foundational idea within sciences, which are in very wonderful manner, which Einstein talks about when he writes a foreword to Max Jammer's book on the concepts of mass, he says, the ultimate reality for science is not matter. It's not these objects and particles. For him, it's about fields. It's these distributions. It's these immaterial, non-localized distributions which become the most important, quote unquote, experiential or observational correlate on which science is based upon. So if that is such a case, in the case of social sciences, what is this problem they have with ontology? And I'm sure many of you who come from sociology, who have looked at social ontology, know the history of these questions. But for me to push at this point, the question for me was, what ontology is acceptable, and where are the resources for you to make your arguments for what ontology is needed to make sense of societies? So when I ask what ontology is needed, there is no way we can make sense of what is happening within what we call as a social phenomena, or many kinds of social phenomena, without first committing to what you think is really out there. It is in that sense we are asking what really is out there in the context of social formations, social processes. And should we then talk about questions of what constitutes social? The reason I'm also saying this is to leave one point with you, which again, many of you may have thought about, which is to say that the limits of ontology of the senses are the limits of the ontology of the world. Those of you who would know Wittgenstein's famous phrasing on language and the world will recognize the similarity of this, which is the limits of the ontology. In other words, what I'm trying to say is, for you to ask the question, what is really present in the world, whether in the social world or the natural world, is first dependent on what your ontology of the senses are. What you begin as the structure of your senses reflects on what is seen as being real in the world, whether the social world or the natural world. And therefore, this is the question which, when we talk about sensory studies, which I've been looking at always, I keep first looking for this, is what is your theory of the senses first, rather than just what senses do, what they don't do, etc. Where is it coming from? How do you define your basic idea of what senses are? And the reason I ask this is because for those who have a problem with the ontology of the social, in other words, is there something called a social? So when I talk about the ontology of the social, the question you're asking is, should we make a commitment to the reality of the social? There's something really called the social, or is it, as has been so well ingrained through methodological individualism and through this particular kind of a response to social ontology, that everything about the social, everything about the collective can be reduced only to individuals. That what you need to take into account as the real facts of the world, the constituents of the world, are individuals out of which any idea of the social is formed. It is a challenge to this question because, and this is a political question, as we'll see by the end, by the time when we come to the end of it. So this idea that all of this idea of the social has to be formed from this constituent assembly of individuals. Okay, and it's not an accident, of course, that Latour's term for this social is about assemblages, right? It is about this bringing together, this coming together of things is what should be hopefully clear to you, is itself an ocular-centric idea. And I just want to give you one example from a fascinating discussion on philosophy to show this larger question about the belief that any idea of a society or the social has to be constituted by the individuals is the prejudice of the eye. It is not necessarily the structure of the world, of the social world. And one interesting, for me, it's really a fascinating study to see this correlate, and one can extend a lot more from this, which is to look at the example of space. Wonderful history within Western philosophy, for example, on philosophy of space, still a very, very important field. For those of you who work in philosophy know, philosophy of space is really still a very active field. There are a lot of wonderful ideas which are present in that. But I want to use one aspect of this discussion on the idea of space in order to make an obvious relation to the idea of the social, because the individuals, the role by individuals play in the formation of the social is like the role objects play in the formation of space. That's a starting point. I want to say what the conclusion of what my argument is, but in order to see where I'm going with it. Now, if you ask somebody, how do we talk about space? Space is often talked in terms of emptiness. In fact, the major debate, very important debate on which Leibniz makes such an important contribution to, on the relational theory of space, the idea that the fact that there is something called space, whether space is something called real, is defined or reducible to the objects which are present in space. So you could either ask a question: are there objects in this room along with the reality of something called space, whatever this emptiness is? Or I could say, to extend the relational point of view, that all that are real and which we accept as existing are only objects. Space is nothing but a set of relations between them. And there is no ontological commitment needed to make to something called space. And you can immediately see where this question of the individual and the social play a very parallel track, a story which runs very parallel to this. That but there's a very important problem which distinguishes the individual, social, and the question of space and objects, which is that for most people, when they talk about the emptiness of space, the emptiness of space is marked by vision, is marked by visual prejudice. The emptiness of space is this emptiness which I see in contrast to the objects that I see. If you lose this visual bias towards the idea of space, then the question is, what exactly could space really be? How would you deal with space in terms of other expressions such as touch, smell, hearing, and so on? What does it actually mean to produce a conceptual world of space, this big grip, this holding on, this grasping this idea of space through conceptual terms like, through sensory terms like touch? And this has been a central problem which distinguishes in some part again, very facile breaking into West and non-West, but as I said, for polemical purposes, I want to use it here. It does make a very important form of distinction between the history of philosophy within the Greek European tradition and the non-Greek European traditions, which is based very much on this particular question of emptiness, of the capacity to be able to experience what seems to be visually empty, that it is actually filled with great potentiality. In fact, one of the most important conceptual term that stands at the foundation of a very important school of Buddhism is based on the doctrine of emptiness. Some of the most important ideas which arises both in Indian mathematics and in philosophical literature is about this idea of complete emptiness, extensions, infinite space, and so on. An idea which, of course, was very difficult for the Greeks to understand in terms of the infinite space extension. So this, okay, I think you missed the point. There's no missing word there. It's just white bread. The white bread has this problem, Now I was trying to see how do you make it sensorially interesting, and yeah, it's the white bread has this problem, okay, but not so in the colored universe. The coloring of white bread, what it does is it produces very different ontologies by which you make sense of the world and your society and so on. And very interestingly too, although it does not happen as in philosophy as much as it happens in mathematics. And that's very ironic considering mathematics becomes such a foundational model for Western philosophy. But in mathematics, the idea of null, the idea of emptiness in some sense, the most wonderfully captured in null set, which many philosophers have latched onto very easily and quickly. The real foundational, if you look at the foundations of mathematics, it rests on the idea, the ontological commitment to null sets. A null set is your first, simplest example of the ontology of the social. A null set is a very interesting object. A set for mathematics is very simple. It's just a collection of objects. You can already see how this idea of the formulation of society and the individual comes. You take any objects, put them together, that's a set. There's nothing more. Now, a null set is, if I keep removing one object by one after the other, what am I left with? You could either say you're left with nothing, but that's a problem because you need to conceptualize this idea of nothing, which, as I said, is such an important foundational philosophical term for many of these non-Western societies. But if you don't do that, then what you're left with is an empty set, which is tautological, or at least it's oxymoronic, because a set is that which has objects. But once you remove objects, you can't have an empty set because it's not a set at all, not an empty set. But empty set becomes the defining ontology of mathematics. It is what allows you to define what are called numbers and then functions and so on. So it's actually a very fascinating question about, on the one hand, a philosophical tension with this idea of emptiness and abstractness, non-sensibility. All the problems with them is about the non-sensibility. It is somehow seen as if the object-oriented, visual coded object-oriented description of the world are accessible, sensorially accessible, whereas the abstract, unseen world, like social and emptiness, etc., are not. They cannot be taken into the ontology. But what I'm trying to point out here is that they are just visual biases. They are not really indicative of the true existence of emptiness or openness and so on. In fact, you can look at the question of space itself in terms of its in terms of its reality as a set of potentialities through touch, not in terms of what is missing in contrast to objects that are visible, but in very different senses. In fact, all the other senses, including touch, smell, hearing, etc., all bring space to us. Very interestingly, in this discussion, there are many different Indian schools. One of them is the logical school called Nyaya. For the Nyaya tradition, when they talk about space, they talk about space as perceivable by sound. Sound becomes that sense by which you can perceive space. Now, what it actually opens up, I'm just pointing out the different resources which is available for you in order to open up our own understanding of senses in the context of societies you live in. So in the case of to come back to this question of the individual and the social is composed of the individual. I want to give one argument as to which I find very persuasive, which is discussed much more greater detail in our books, and which is the fact that if you think, given this visual bias, that I think I'm only looking at individuals now, and then I have to construct something called the social from this collection of individuals, right? So one way to question this presupposition is to ask, am I really seeing individuals? Even with my ocular centrism, am I actually perceiving individuals? Am I actually seeing individual objects? And I have and I'm not able to see this missing space, emptiness. Is it that the individual that you think you see, are they really truly individuals? Two of the most important markers of localization, that which defines what objects are, for the visually, from the context of the visual sense, what constitutes an object is a boundary, is a particular form of localization, which is present in every object that we see. It occupies the fundamental definition of object. You don't need much more than that, is to say that it is spatio-temporally extended. It is present. It occupies certain kind of space and time, and they are marked by a boundary. But if we extend that argument to say that we are all objects and that there is a social which is formed among these objects only through this collection of these objects, then the first question you have to ask is that the two most important markers of individuality, my body and therefore my senses are mine, my body is mine. And definitely in the context of our modern disciplines, the individuality is also marked by the mind. So the mind is really what stands for each one of us, because the body is something which is shared, and therefore in the valorizing of the idea of the mind and the intellect, then the mind begins to stand as your marker of individuality. So if you want to question that, you have to question that in order to question the possibility of the ontology of the social, then you have to question both these possibilities. One, is the mind really a marker of the individual? And two, of course, are the senses and body really something to do with the individual, or is it something far more complex? And if you look at both these points, and I'll just make a very brief, I'm not going to say much about this, but I just wanted to, tell you that there's so much of work in this, which argues fundamentally. So the basic conclusion of this argument is that the idea that the mind is individuated is a problematical idea. It is very possible, not very possible. I think it's something which many of us may be able to see intuitively obvious, that the mind is already social in a very fundamental, profound sense of the term. So there have been many models to understand how a mind could be social. So there are approaches such as the social approaches to the mind, the extended mind hypothesis, the question of collective intentionality and group agency. It's also related to this question of group intelligence. Very interesting work on various animals and humans have also been done on that. And then there's also this argument that there is something called the social brain, and the fact there's an evolutionary argument that the brain actually evolves in trying to make sense of social processes rather than of just individual existence in the world. And all of these seem to immediately suggest that the idea that individuals are primary in any construction of the social is a problem. At least it's something we'll have to make sense of. We'll have to give an account for what is it that lies at the basis of our belief that we are independent individuals upon which a notion of a collective is composed. Whereas in everything that we do, including in our mental space, including everything that you do in your mind, is actually deeply socialized, influenced by larger kinds of social terms. And there are many other kinds of arguments for this, one of which is, of course, that language itself I often find this when we talk to my students, every time we have this question, because when we have writing workshops, and many of my writing workshops, I try and get students to write together, co-author things. And the greatest resistance I've found with students is to writing something together. There is something about writing that they feel is so individual. It's mine in a very fundamental sense. And one of the ways by which I try and make sense of that to them is to ask them a very simple question. Language itself is not yours. Everything that you produce as language is social. It is gifted. It is produced over thousands of years. And then I use it to express something. It does not mean that we do not have individual expressions which mark out some notion of individuality, but that is already resting on a fundamental basis of social action, social processes. So if you look at this particular point of view, then we have to just to conclude, to say that the mind is that there is something called as social mind is something which we need to take very seriously. In contrast, people have tried to show that questions of cognition, thinking, etc., have been very important. And if you look at even that, I'm sure, since there are many sociologists here, Zerubbabel's work, optical socialization. So even in the context of thinking, that it is very difficult to argue that even thinking marks something very important about the idea of the individual. So I just went through it very quickly and briefly just to make this argument, to set the two stages of the argument, that if you want to understand the individual in terms of the social completely, because the marks of individuation of the mind and the body and the senses, the mind, we have some reasons, at least we have proposed certain arguments to say that the mind is already social in some fundamental sense, and therefore the individual, another way to put it is, the individual has to be recovered from a given social. And that recovery of the individual marks different genres of what constitutes an individual, different theories of the individual. Now, in all of these very interesting work in social minds and so on, there is something which is missing, which is the account of the senses. And that's a larger problem with modern disciplines which did not seem to take senses deeply for various reasons, as a very strong philosophical bias too. So the final the point about individuality, if the mind is already social, then perhaps we can argue that the body is individualized. There is an individuation characteristic within my senses and body. My senses are mine. They are not shared, like, let's say, like language. But this too has been challenged. And I think, as David mentioned, a very pioneering work was, of course, sociology of the senses. And I must say that it is my own introduction to sensory studies and David's work, which shifted my focus from the earlier work in which I was looking at the concept of the social ontology, etc., by taking more of the account of the idea of the senses. But if you look at the sociology of the senses, there is something which is, I'm sure many of you know this far better than I do, but very briefly, the point we need to take into account there is that Simmel begins by drawing parallel with the natural sciences. And there are immediate consequences of that, right? There is a consequence. There's also a kind of a paradigm which influences somebody like Durkheim. So the idea that the interaction between individuals is based upon the same simple fact that we have a sensory effect upon one another radically changes the simple reductive picture of society. There is something far more interesting happening through using sensory as a mechanism. And he talks about the social life as related to to smell, which is a very interesting account which he discusses. But I still think, from my reading of it, that there's a lot of oculocentric problem within Simmel's understanding of senses and its relation to the social. Not necessarily only in its obvious connection to natural science, the idea of microscopy, the idea of atomic structures interacting with each other, but also on the fact that he misses one of the most important sense of touch, sense in the formation of the social, which is that of touch. And there is a very brief remark he mentions, including about some social practice in India, but he really misses the fundamental formulation of the importance of the touch in producing a concept of the collective and the group. And I think that's part of, in spite of his very shrewd observations on the role by which senses are necessary foundation for building an idea of the social, he misses this larger question of taking social ontology as a possibility. That is, that what is really happening in our sensory experiences is that we are not experiencing individuals alone, but we are experiencing an entity called a social. Whichever way you want to make sense of it. Now, for us, when we did the crack mirror and the work it followed, the reason why we moved towards this idea of talking about the social as a primary real social reality upon which all other social processes have to be modeled arose because of our empirical work on the nature of Indian society. And so one can extrapolate parts or may not be able to extrapolate parts, but I just want to very briefly mention that it is trying to give an account of very simple aspects of what are called as caste experiences, where there could be some correlate, as has been very popular in the US these days, to connect race and caste and so on. But you could see that there are very different other kinds of social processes in other societies which do duplicate this. And the most important aspect of that arose from our repeated experience of people talking about senses of communities, not senses of individuals. That it was groups of people who smelt in a particular manner. It was groups of people who could be touched or not touched. It was not about individuals at all. The reduction of the social into the individuals was strongly resisted through this vocabulary of smelling the social, seeing the social, touching the social, and so on. So it was almost as if the kind of social formation that you follow in the context of sensory experiences, in the context of my sensory experiences of social phenomena, that's what I mean, are all being in terms of social groups which are non-reducible. And I'm sorry, this non-reducibility was actually far more interesting for us because in many of the accounts by which caste system itself gets produced and propagated, it is by one could call this as a strategy, or one could call this as a way in which one empirically experiences a social reality, which is that different groups and communities get marked through sensory capacities, just like you would mark individual rose with particular smell and some other mango with another smell. You actually there was a resistance to reducing those to individual smells, individual touch, individual sight, and so on. And that gets converted into very deep social practices related to the way in which social orders are reproduced in a society. The caste systems really gives you a very simple example of that, because to make sense of it, of course, is that you have to then go back into, and this is what I meant when I said, where does the resources for understanding senses come from? To make sense of this, then we had to go and ask the question, how are senses understood from different cultural terminologies in terms of their intellectual production? That is, what is their philosophy of smell? And if you really look at, and this is true of every philosophical tradition, as I said, they produce very interesting philosophies of what smell is, what touch is, and so on. So I'll give you just an example just to show you. In the context of philosophical descriptions in Indian thought, the smell is actually is a very interesting term, and at least for one of the schools, smell in the hierarchy of the senses plays the highest role. But there are other connotations with smell which are extremely interesting. All those connotations are social. That smell is not just smell which is reduced to certain kinds of molecular action of some flower or fruit and so on. It produces, there is a smell of qualities of various kinds of qualities, including moral qualities. Suffering as a smell, impermanence as a smell. There are descriptions on which through smell you can know somebody's going to die. The smell actually has a completely different world in which it builds its stories upon. But all of these, it's not just about cultural stories about what smell is. What is important to recognize is all of them are based on particular ontologies of the senses, their particular understanding of what each of these sense organs are and how they actually function in there. So therefore, in the context of Indian case, and I'm sure I've seen some very interesting work on smell in other societies, including the American one with perfumes and so on. But if you really look at the nature of smell, if you analyze it in this sense, it seems very clear that that there is you don't actually smell something, but you smell a particular social. And which means, in other words, what this implies is that if you get over this visual bias that we do not perceive the collective, then you have to ask yourself, how do I cultivate my other senses to be able to perceive, to sense the social? And smell is one particular aspect of it, and touch is. There's also similar thing on the touch, and the touch is again, as I said, there's been a major work which started off all of this is to make sense of untouchability. So I won't say much about it, and I just want to conclude in 2 minutes. But just to point out that this phenomena of untouchability is really not about not touching an individual. The individuals actually don't factor into this larger ontological world of untouchability. Untouchables are groups. What is it that makes communities and groups as such become untouchables? And this is something which is, a very troubling question in the context of India, definitely. And there have been various accounts, as I'm sure you have seen, of other societies having correlates of caste system and so on. Elizabeth's book now uses caste as a major framework for Nazism and casteism, etc. Which, and that's a different kind of an approach and a problem. But still, the belief that we are marked in the context of social interaction through particular kinds of social sensations, which are all related to communities as groups and not as humans as individuals, really raises very important problem for us to take into account. And in the context of touch, of course, I'll just end with reading these last two points that, as I said, the whole metaphysics of touch, the ontology of touch is so interesting. And even in the context of touch, we have to take into account that unless you have an account of what you mean by skin. So when you say skin is organ of touch, the first thing which many of these philosophical traditions do is to give an account of skin, not as a biological account of skin like this, or the epidermis, or whatever you want to call it biologically, but in terms of layers of skin. So the fact that our skin is actually, in one particular formulation, there are 7 layers of skin. And when you start looking at the skin in that particular form and you ask yourself, what are you really touching? What is touching what when I hold this particular mic? It's actually really a very interesting and a profound question. And so our study of untouchability really went into this simple question. What are you actually touching and what are you not actually touching? And to believe that just that there is this one grasp of the skin on the other is somehow a sense of touch misses the larger, ontology of what that thing is. So the final point, I'll just read a page here, is to, since it's much faster for me to do it, and I just want to, this is part of my, the continuing work on this, which is really where I want to push this work into. There are many different consequences of the skin and stuff. So in the technology of touch through which we sense the social, skin plays 2 important roles, one as an organ of touch and the other as a boundary of the individual. Therefore, when the social is counterposed against the individual, it's actually based on the topography of the skin. This image enables a possibility of envisioning the domain of the social that is defined by its skin, namely the skin of the social. This image is in line with the common trope that viewed society in the model of a human body, found in various functionalists in sociology. The equivalence between body and society, of course, can be found across in various lanes, and caste descriptions has very similar correlation to that. One might say that the descriptions of a society in this manner are metaphorical and do not make a substantial commitment to a social entity. On the other hand, there is a counter argument that the reason why such images have been produced and sustained over centuries is fundamentally because of an experience of the social world which does not neatly fit into modernist ontological categories, particularly related to materialism. Now, I want to use this brief discussion to foreground the ontological primacy of the skin of the social. My claim is as follows. The primary modality of sensing the social is through touch. The skin is the organ of touch in the body. Touching the social is not the same as touching an inanimate object. Touching the social is to touch other humans, is to touch something more than individual humans. Touching another human is a touch of one's skin on another. It's a reversible relation, like one hand touching the other. I didn't want to mention this after David said, don't talk about Merleau-Ponty, but you know, without naming him, I've just passed. The skin is also the container which contains not just the material insides of a body, but the self. The social skin is the container which contains the members of the social group, but also the sense of social self. The reversible relation of touching touched holds good for the touch of my skin with the social skin. We do not see social interactions. They become social only when they touch me in the most literal sense. As I had mentioned earlier, the idea of lived experience is the experience which touches the self the most. The association of touch as a moral sense leads to the possibility that the moral codes of a society are framed around the phenomenology of social touch. So, lastly, the many layers of the skin that characterizes human skin also has a correspondence with the many layers of the social skin. We do not touch another body, but only the skin. Touching does not reach the insides of another body. The surface mediates the interaction between two individuals. However, the skin as a surface represents and brings forth the insides of the body. So, although we might only be touching another person's skin, how we touch, the intensity of touch, makes a difference. Different intensities give differential access to the insides of each other. The implication of this argument is if that the social is accessible through touch, then it is only the surface of the social that is first accessible. The quality of touch between the individual and the social is the quality of the experience of the social. So this explains what it means to have the experience of being X, whatever that X is. One can access the experience of being something at a surface level. Note that the use of surface level itself indicates itself is based on an image of touch. But for some, the sense of touch of this experience can be deeper than these surfaces. Through touching the skin of the social, we touch the skin of others like us. The modes and intensities of touching lead to different levels of belongingness to a group. So I was reading this. This is, as I said, an incomplete ontological project of trying to make sense of what constitutes human relationship. It is very much influenced by the last point about which I won't talk about more, which is part of my book on social life of democracy, which David mentioned. It's on Ambedkar's work. Ambedkar, the greatest revolutionary in resisting this question of caste and untouchability, is also somebody whom you can read through this larger context of sensory study. So for me, that was another great opening, which I learned from engagement with David and all of you here, that how to relook at what have been very standard practices of evaluating. So what somebody like Ambedkar is doing in terms of a very deep engagement with very specific questions of senses. And much of what Ambedkar talks about fraternity as a central core, a fellow beingness with others, are actually modeled on the sense of social touch to a very profound extent. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Sundar, for completely destabilizing all of our minds, okay? Well, the idea of imaginary numbers is introduced. Unexamined is the fact that, okay, that supposes that all the other numbers are real. Not, okay, not. Space is empty. And that's the container understanding of space, but actually space is full of all kind of tactile potentials that are simply not realized. And John Clark brought that home to us ever so powerfully in his presentation a little bit earlier today. And another way of just sort of getting at this extraordinary notion of sensing the social. If you look at the word individual, it comes from the Latin individuum. And actually, individuum referred to that which is indivisible. Okay, so the individual is that which is indivisible. Now, to arrive at that notion, you start with the social and you arrive at the individual. Whereas a modern conception is that society is made up of individuals. So there's a basic kind of flip that goes on there, which is, again, unthought. And what you've been doing is calling us to think all these unthought parts of our ontologies. And just as an example, Tim Ingold, one of my favorite authors, says, I can touch another individual, I can see an individual, but have you ever seen society? Hey, have you ever smelled society? And the idea is that, well, no, society is an abstraction. Okay, that's the idea. But Ingold is here appealing to the evidence of the senses to suggest that yes, we can know individuals, but we can't know society. What you bring out with this idea of sensing the social is how actually our experience of each other, is involved in sensing. And maybe one example of what you're pointing to is how, okay, you can think of us as an assemblage of individuals. That word assemblage is very distributed right now, but let's think of ourselves as a choir. Okay, let's all hum. Okay, all of a sudden our individuality is dissolved. Okay, in just the way you're describing, that we can approach these, through other senses. And maybe the problem is with the ocular centric assumptions that are there to begin with. But what I really found sort of so extraordinary about, your perspective is interleaving, sort of Indian philosophical understandings. And yet at the same time, one of the things that you and Gopal Guru have been extraordinarily forceful in your assertion is that don't just take the categories, the concepts and methods of Western social science and apply them in India, okay? Because they're going to distort that reality. And so therefore you need a multicultural social science, which I think was part of your point about chilies. And I hope we get some chilies in for tonight's banquet, okay? I mean, I was going to smother you in maple syrup, but we've definitely got to go out and get some chilies in order to begin to engage with that extraordinary, challenge and that, white bread with chilies. Whoa, it sounds, powerful. So, but it's that element of like, one of the really forceful arguments that you made in the cracked mirror, was that idea that, we have to get beyond the Eurocentric categories that have, informed this discourse all the time. How do we get that? How do we get beyond that? I don't know if you'd like to address that.
Sure. Please. Thank you, David. You're as generous as always. So your response to my talk. So Eurocentrism is, I think most people tend to accept it. I mean, it's polite conversation to say, it's Eurocentric. It's really not about as much as Eurocentric as the larger, simpler question, which is to ask, what are the categories which I need in order to make sense of any reality? Whether it's from scientific world, natural scientific world, mathematical reality, or social reality. And incidentally, before I forget, you should tell your good friend Ingold that mathematical entities cannot be seen, cannot be smelt, but without the reality of them, there is no edifice of modern natural science. So to me, social, the reality of the social is much easier than the reality of mathematical entities, which is a founding principle of Platonism, which underlies modern knowledge systems, not just modern mathematical. Modern knowledge systems are based on this belief that non-spatio-temporal, non-causal things, like numbers and others, are the true foundations of our physical reality. So what's the big deal? And the social is actually too much sensible in that sense. But anyway, the larger question was this: the struggle for us was not the lack of using of categories from other philosophical traditions to make sense of our experiences. The centrism comes when it excluded the possibility of using categories produced by those people who experience it as a form of legitimate theoretical description of themselves. So I must give you very briefly the background to this. Gopal Guru is a very well-known political theorist and philosopher who was at one of our big universities in India called Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi. Was asked to give in a memorial lecture in Delhi. He spoke about how Indian social science is hegemonic. And he raised this question. He said, why is it that all descriptions of Dalit sociology, description of the so-called earlier untouchables or the marginalized communities of the Dalits. The theoretical work, the theoretical social work is being produced by non-Dalits, primarily people of higher caste. So he coined this wonderful term called theoretical Brahmins and empirical Shudras. In a sense, Indian social science functions under this category of theoretical Germans and French and empirical Indians. If you extend it, Asia and Africa are only empirical subjects which need the theoretical framework even of somebody like Aristotle and Plato. Poor chaps, I feel sorry for Aristotle. Everybody is using him all the time. Make sense of what is happening in Asia and Africa. And I think it's insightful. I mean, when I did this work on untouchability, I did draw upon, the Indian theories on how they made sense of touch, the meaning of sense of touch and skin, but also on this unnamed philosopher whom I mentioned, Merleau-Ponty, and also Derrida, because they write something really profoundly interesting about the nature, what is meant by the word untouchable. And in fact, when I use them, I'm contrasting it with how you go beyond that to produce a theory of the untouchable. So what I'm trying to say is, the problem is not about a more multicultural, or I like the term you are mentioning about Quebec, intercultural way of drawing upon your categorical perceptions of the world, which matter to me. But the problem is the asymmetry in it. There is no program in the world, in the global north, which teaches, you don't teach your student, I mean you, I don't mean individuals, I'm saying the global north you, who don't teach the amazing kind of theoretical work, whether it can be from philosophy and aesthetics, such wonderful work on the body. I mean, the rediscovery of the body in the West, often puzzles me. I said, you guys are waking up so late for this. There is so much of interesting stuff on the functions. It's actually very body-centric societies. That's why none of them make this fundamental Descartesian fallacy of hiding into the mind, which is decoupled from the body. And therefore, everything you had to bring the body to be given account of your actions. So the point about Eurocentrism was the fact that to understand the experiences of our societies, we are only using the framework produced from very different experiential contexts. And I'll share this also here. I mentioned it in Crack Mirror, but I don't mention the name of it. But here now I can share it because unfortunately he's no longer with us. But Bruno Latour. There's one incident with my interaction with him, which I mentioned in the book. Bruno Latour came once to Bangalore. He was there for just a day. He said I was on leave. He called me and said, I'm here with his wife. And he said, shall we meet up for dinner or something? So I said, great. He was there for a couple of days. But then I told him, I want to bring my students to meet you because I am not as avid a reader of you as my students are. And all these students are social science students. They were all working on caste system, bureaucracy in India, forest rights in something. They're all working on typical social science projects. And for them, the theoretical framework was only Latour, or of course, Bourdieu, whatever. So I said, please meet them because, they know all your stuff. So he was very gracious, he and his wife. So I took 10 of our students and he was like totally shocked because they were like asking him, in page 33, you mentioned this. And he was like, did I really say all that? These guys knew more about his work than he did, but, they were deeply engaged with his work. And so he was sufficiently inspired that although he had said he wouldn't come to my institute the next day, he said, I'll come and talk to your students over lunch. And he came to the institute. And then there, in front of all of them, I asked him a question I wanted to ask him so that the students will know this. So I asked him, are you surprised that your work is so much used by all these people for all these kinds of work they're doing among marginalized and this and that in various parts of India? And he said, I'm paraphrasing here, but this is largely what he said. Very laconic, so he's not being rude, but he actually said, I'm not interested in India or China. He had come from China. He said, they don't matter to me. He said, I'm trying to make sense of my society and the fact that Europe has been misunderstood. Right? So when he said that, he's not saying he didn't care about India. He said, my preoccupations of the theoretical arise from my engagement with this experiential around me, and I'm trying to make sense of it. So he was puzzled, yeah, in a sense, that you don't find anything in your experiences of the local from which you formulate categories. He was puzzled because he is worried about some problem in Paris or France. He's confused a little bit. How does it matter to all these communities in India you're working with? If you could show that, that's very interesting. But theory doesn't work that way, right? Theory works as application. As a good friend of mine was in at Princeton, anthropologist, a well-known person, many of you may know. Once he was complaining about this question about theory and theorists, he said, even for my students, and he was talking about his Princeton anthropologist, he said, they mistake theory for theorists. And this is a problem we have with our students all the time. Theory is theorist. So it's not about the work of theory. And that's why our first book is called Debate on Experience and Theory. The work of theory is not to present the voice and words of a theory, some theorist who is going to give categories for my work, but rather to be able to engage with the empirical far more sensorially, to really get into the dirt. That's the real point about the Euro question that you're talking about. Sorry.
No, absolutely. Now, one of those who is a great admirer of your work and that of Gopal Guru is somebody for whom I have great admiration, Boaventura de Souza Santos, who has a book called The End of the Cognitive Empire, The Coming of Age of Epistemologies of the South. What is the global North? What is the epistemology and sociology of the North? It's Bruno Latour. Okay, it is all of those authorities, those theorists who we treat as authorities, and they do science, whereas others do, I don't know, anything but science. Okay, so the global South, Santos's argument is there is a coming of age. And what will happen, what needs to happen, is that abyssal line, okay, that separates and privileges science as understood in the global North, and will be overcome. How do we overcome that line? And he sees you as articulating these counterpositions by dissolving it, okay, by pointing out Bruno Latour, he's not concerned with India. And yet all of these young Indian academics are using his language. If only they could stop for a moment and reflect on their own experience. So you are calling us to experience. You are calling us, I would say, to our senses in a really interesting way. And indeed, one of the most beautiful chapters in The End of the Cognitive Empire. Okay, so cognitive empire, it's too simple, but is the global North, which has imposed its hegemony, which involves capitalism, patriarchy, and so forth on the whole world. So the end of that empire is beautifully addressed in a chapter that he has called The Deep Experience of the Senses. And so, this is a larger conversation, and it's coming to our senses and understanding the social, through that, that, will in turn. But instead, we're caught up by these very particular theories, which are universal because they're Western, but they're not at all. It's my point about psychology, okay? I just want to come back to that. Who are the subjects of psychology experiments? They are all weird. They are Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. Who are they? They're university students, okay? Psychologists, when they want research subjects, either they take mice or they take university students. And they pay them a pittance, but they get all this data and they formulate their theories of perception and cognition and so forth. But they're all weird. They are not representative. I'm sorry if there are any students amongst us, okay? But you are not representative. And yet, the categories of psychology are universalized. And so this is the challenge that I believe you are presenting. Now, listen, again, I'm not a person who should be a moderator because I get so immoderate. I get engaged, but I feel like this. So you have questions, I'm sure, and please, feel free to address them to our guests. Please go. I think actually, could you come to this microphone, if you mind, often?
Yes. Hi, I just want to say thank you for your presentation. Really engaging, very interesting. Something that struck me towards the end of your presentation, I kind of just wanted to hear your comment on this, but I was thinking about the impact of COVID-19 and the global pandemic and on this idea of sensing the social. I wondered if you could speak about perhaps your perspective or like how your research or that idea of sensing the social has impacted this idea of touch and how, I mean, we're all sat in a room together now and sat in very close proximity, and that wouldn't have been possible.
Yeah.
I just wondered if you could speak on that impact and how maybe we became disengaged with each other. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And very difficult question because it's been also, as I said, closely connected with our concerns about the COVID, which had already come before the COVID hit us, which is also called digital technology. And we're already been, those notions of social alienation had become so deep, including in very quote unquote touchy societies like India and so on. Touchy in the sense, far more compacted, far more social in various ways. And that impact had already begun the forms of alienation, which comes out as a medical crisis in COVID, but as a social crisis was, I think, already prefigured in that. And so, in some of the writing I'd done there, repeatedly, I was coming back to just the one point, as one of my titles of the articles was, do we really need others? And that's a question which has actually been a lot on my mind post-COVID. How does this idea of others actually matter to us? And how do they, whether they really matter to us as a social entity or not? And yeah, so it was in India. I think the kind of effect we had was very different from the way what happened. For example, I'm sure here in India, it's very difficult to make anybody follow any rules, right? Including signal lights. So the COVID, yeah, there were all these kinds of rules and stuff, but I know, even at the height of it, people were, everything was going on and so on. So there were some terrible deaths and stuff like that. But yeah, as a social process, I've really not been able to really understand and digest it as much as I've heard from colleagues who have been in these societies who have had far, visceral reaction to what happened at that time.
I think that is a very profound question. Ironically, the practice that we had to adopt was social distancing, as if distancing is ever social. Okay, the point of this is precisely that sensing the social engages the senses. And what did COVID do? It targeted the proximity senses. Okay, taste and smell and touch, and it took our breath away. And that was the most insidious disease imaginable. There are other similar ones, precisely because it did destroy the social. Have we recovered the social since? Have we recovered? I don't really feel that in this university. I feel, first of all, that the students that came in during the COVID pandemic, they never got a full education. They never got socialized. They never sort of really experienced what we know in terms of collegiality. And in that regard, how are we going to recover our senses after COVID? So it's a very important question. Please, Peter.
Thank you, both of you. My brain is just exploding right now from your wisdom, so I'm very pleased with this. Now, I study North America. I study the global North, and now I'm going to ask you to speculate. What would be some directions that you would like to see us take Indian knowledge of society and apply it to our world, and with the same kind of passion that your students in India have had for Latour? Like, what are some of the groups of people we should be studying? What are some of the forms of relationship, social formations, anything that can come to mind? And I apologize. I know it's a speculative question that I'm asking of you.
No, thank you so much, Peter. It's such a very important question. It goes very deeply to what I've been constantly saying for a long time. I'll just give you an example. When I was a grad student in the US, I met this girl whom I eventually ended up marrying. But no, I don't. It sounds regretful. It's not. I just meant it as, she was an anthropology student. I mean, my entry into anthropology and learning about anthropology came from that. And she had wanted to study the US for a graduate work. And typically the graduate programs, in the US at that time, this is the late 80s, early 90s also, I think, yeah, they were willing to give her support to do a PhD program in anthropology if she went and studied tribals and caste groups in India. And she said, I'm better than any of your participant observation you're going to train to send to other countries. I speak your language, I live it, I've been part of your society, and I want to study that society. Not a single program, even though some programs told her, if you change your topic, we'll take you. Not a single. She said, no. I don't think much has changed. I have a lot of my friends, students also who went to the US, they're doing anthropology, etc. And they're sent back to India to study marginal communities compared to their own social standing. I'm not making a value judgment on it. I'm just saying. Oh, okay.
Don't study your own. Okay, is the message, and you're right.
Yeah.
Extraordinary insight. Of North American society, it's not happening. You can have value judgment.
Okay, then I know why I'm saying that is the point was that the West has always seen itself as having an impartial gaze towards the others, and that they can reproduce stories of other cultures. You look at caste system. Caste system in India, every student in India has some experience of it or not. It is impossible to escape the pervasive influence of these experiences in their lives. You go join a sociology department. What do you do in caste system? You read Weber, Dumont, Durkheim, very important. Of course, you'll read a couple of Indian authors, M.N. Srinivas and others. But the conceptual work, I mean, people like M.N. Srinivas were as empiricists. They wrote about the reality of living with shepherds and writing about various processes of that. But the real difficult language, the so-called theoretical, philosophical, came from the Germans and the French. And Weber, as far as I know, has never visited India. And he is writing on religious societies when used on India is just shocking to me. It's not a judgment on the value of his work. It's very important for the society he's worked in. But for us to think that even without encountering that, you can write about it. That was the question. That's why in the Cracked Mirror, the first discussion and the way I made the distinction was between authorship and ownership. So we experience, but somebody else has to author our experiences in ways which are acceptable to whom I don't know, but it's acceptable. So this was a problem, right? So we have had that kind of an issue throughout in the way in which the West can represent Indians and what we can learn from them about our own selves. To understand caste, which is part of my reality, I have to read these people to make sense of it. Now, in such a situation, how are they ever going to allow the non-West to represent them, to write about them, to be able to tell their stories in the way Europeans wrote about Indian stories? And that's why when I meant about spice, there was a very snide comment I had made there, which I had to expand, which is that, look, colonialism happened because of your interest in spice. You came all over there because you wanted to take spice, but then you found gold and diamond and you took that instead. So now it's time to go back to the spice, start with what you had wanted to do and now come and take the spice. So the point was very simple, that it's impossible for us to be able to represent the West. And that will happen only if we can teach ideas. We don't have to call it a grand philosophy. There's been such a big fight whether Indian philosophy should be called philosophy or not, whether Chinese philosophy and African philosophy should be called philosophy or not. In American and British universities, even today, in spite of a lot of resistance, Indian people who work on Indian logic, for example, or Indian philosophy of language, are put in the religious studies department. And, people have tried everything. Nobody bothered about it till New York Times had two American professors who both, one works on Chinese and one works on Buddhist thought, wrote a piece in New York Times, an op-ed saying, call your department's Department of Western Philosophy. Don't call yourself Department of Philosophy. That is a problem. If I write something, it's not called philosophy. If it is based on Indian philosophical terms, it is to be called as Indian philosophy. So the ghettoization happens there. So one answer to that is, that's why I said it's this wonderful spice box. It's available, especially in the digital world. It's available to look at. People often tell me, I don't know Sanskrit, I don't know this, how will I read? I don't know Chinese and so on. But today there has been so much of translation. Ideas are present. Why cannot ideas be pollinated and polarized? And for me, I often say, if I present the Indian or the Chinese or African thinkers as an obscure French tradition, you'll have 10 students working on it. Just because you call these guys, they're from China or something, you immediately feel that, oh, I'm not able to draw upon them. So there has to be a social shift towards going away from the primary colonial project of describing Asians and Africans as children or as those who are not adults enough to understand the theoretical mind. To the extent that so much of look at Gadamer, even 10, 20 years or 90s, I think, even he writes a book on knowledge, begins by saying Asiatic cultures do not have the concept of knowledge. And I'm like, who publishes you guys? But anyway, so I think, can any of you do that? Can we bring them into this? I had asked this to my German colleagues. I said, so much of violence, we talked about Holocaust and so on. Do you teach Gandhi or Ambedkar in your classes? Do you teach the Jaina theory of non-violence as a central core of discussing in the class? Not so that everybody's going to work on that, just to pollinate. Bring the spice box, leave it. If they like a particular spice, let them take it. If not,
Sundar, I can't, begin to express our gratitude to you for spicing things up. Okay, you're sort of, going to spice up sensory studies. I was just going to put a sugar coating on it at the banquet tonight with all of the, the maple syrup products that you're going to have to consume. Otherwise, you'll get them as leftovers tomorrow. What I want to say is just that, if you look at this very word theory, you'll find that it means to look, to gaze upon. That's the Greek definition, theoria. And so, not surprising, some of the biases that you've been exposing. And this is why we need to sensualize theory. We need to spice it up in just the ways you've describing through these processes of cross-pollination. And one of the things you said to me is that this is such a remarkable interdisciplinary group that, that kind of cross-pollination can occur. And let me just in that regard refer to the official policy of the province of Quebec, which is not multiculturalism, as in Canada, where each culture can celebrate itself, but interculturalism. Now, we don't live up to it here, but imagine that, interculturalism, okay? Not societies, communities distributed and, sort of looking at themselves or being concerned with celebrating themselves, but that a condition of being a citizen of Quebec is to engage in an intercultural exchange. It's a beautiful idea. Haven't even begun to live up to it. In fact, the CAQ government is going in the opposite direction, but it's, I think, moving in the direction. So one last question for Sadia.
A hypothetical question about whether we can co-create a maple and chili sauce this evening. Because the thing is that I'm Pakistani on one side and Canadian on the other. And up until 10 years old, I grew up with maple syrup, pouring it over snow in the morning while my parents were still sleeping, and stuffing it in my mouth. And then on the other hand, growing up with spicy chili, and I didn't take particularly well to having to choose between one or the other. So that's just really like my only offering.
Thank you. I think that's really. And the question for me is, and I'm just worried that too much of this interculture, multicultural stops at the level of food. While I want to start with food, I want to go beyond it. I want to see it happening in conceptual categories. grasping of different ideas and different concepts and seeing what we do with it. None of it is about truth or false, just holding it, touching it, doing something with it, and seeing where it takes you, what we produce. Yeah, definitely maple syrup with all these kinds of things would be wonderful too. And Canada, in that sense, has been far, especially today, considering what's happening to your neighbor. It's such a delightful experiment, I think. I don't know, from what we see from the outside.
Thank you very much for the
Thank
comments here. We don't deserve it, but thank you. We'll take it.
Yeah.
Sundar, thank you.
Thank you.